Howdy, howdy, this is Mr. Potter. What we're going to talk about in today's video is the need for DNS. We've talked a little bit about DNS, or domain name servers, in a previous video, because we've talked about how not everyone will be able to remember something like 74.125.224.72. Certainly not as easy as you would remember something like Google.com. And so what happens is we have the IP address, which is something that computers do well with because computers deal with numbers very well. But then you have DNS, the domain name service, because humans deal with text a lot better than we deal with numbers. And it's easier for me to remember Google.com than it is for me to remember the seemingly random set of numbers that's assigned to one of Google's computers. So we, in general, come up with this idea of domain names that we deal with rather than IP numbers, just because as humans we deal with text a lot better. There are a lot of different things in this hierarchy of domain names. In America, we usually deal with .com, or .org, or .net, and then on a little bit more restricted sense we have .edu and .mil. These two are a little bit more restricted because it's very difficult to get a .edu address unless you are a recognized educational, and usually it has to be a post-secondary educational corporation. And it's almost impossible to get a .mil unless you're involved with the military. .gov falls under this as well. Unless you're actually part of the federal government, you're probably not going to be able to get access to a .mil or a .gov domain name. But the .com, .org, .net, and keep in mind this covers anything, and we usually use an asterisk to denote a wild card where this could be anything before this. So if I wanted to talk about Google.com or Wikipedia.org or MIT.edu or USAF.mil or WhiteHouse.gov, if I wanted to talk about any of these domain names, these are the domain names that are currently under the purview of originally the United States, and then after that the world kind of fluxed in. We also have governmental domain names, where each country kind of has its own purveyance. So the UK, the United Kingdom, is in charge of all domain names that end in .uk. And the United Kingdom government basically gets to decide who can and can't get a domain name that ends in .uk. Similar to France, France has its FR. If I wanted to look at China, China would have a .cn for China. The United States even has its own two-letter domain name, and you'll often see this used for state governments. You'll see like .tx.us or .vt.us, where you'll see the two-letter state identifier right before that two-letter United States identifier. And some of these are obvious which country you're talking about by looking at these two letters. Some maybe so. I mean, if you were to know that DE is the first two letters in Deutsch, so if you're looking at Deutschland, that would be Germany. Some of these are not at all intuitive. For example, CH has to deal with Switzerland. Because the classical Latin name for Switzerland is Helvetica, which makes no sense at all. There are some older domain names that no longer are in existence. For example, the Soviet Union used to have .su, and it's almost impossible to get a .su name. Similarly, you could have Deutschland Demokratica, the East German countries, and so most of these belong to countries which just no longer exist. So like Yugoslavia, you can't get a .yu name, but these were restricted to those. Some of these are just very restricted by their government. So you might see something like KP, which stands for North Korea, the People's Republic of Korea. So you won't necessarily be able to get this, but there are a few websites that are out there that belong to this this .kp. And then there are a few others that are a little bit different. So, for example, you've got .eu, which stands for the whole European Union, not just one country in Europe, but the entire European Union. You also have .int, which seems like it should go with EU, but keep in mind that .int deals with not just Europe, but international as a whole. So a couple of domain names you would see here is you would see something like NATO.int, because you've got the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This covers both the American side and the European side. Or you might see the Young Men's Christians Association.int, because this is an international organization. It's not just in one continent. So there are lots of different hierarchies out there. Keep in mind that in the case of these, we have domain name service providers, registrars that can order the names for you. And each of these governments have their own as well, but they're a little bit more restrictive about who can own a .cn name. We also have building a domain name, which a domain name usually has several parts to it. We are most familiar with the top level domain name, so something like .com, and then you'll also see the company name. And of course I'm using company loosely, but if I were to do something like Google, that would make sense. So you'd have google.com, or you'd have wikipedia.org. And then over here you'll see something which is commonly known as server. But again, I put this server in quotations because back in the day you'd be talking about one particular computer or one particular department at this. And so it may not be just www, but it may be drive.google.com, or it may be classroom.google.com. Or for Wikipedia, it might be en.wikipedia.org, or it might be FR for the French version of Wikipedia, or ZH if you're talking about the Chinese version of Wikipedia. In general, it's supposed to refer to a server, but it's usually just talking about a particular category in here. And of course, one that you'll see quite pervasive, especially now with mobile technology, is you may see just the .m. So if you were to go to m.google.com, then what you would see is you would see the mobile version of Google. Or if you went to en.m.wikipedia.org, then you would see the mobile version of the English language Wikipedia. And on top of this, we're seeing the internationalization of the web a little bit more. We're not seeing just the traditional Latin letters, A through Z. We're also seeing a lot more of the letters that are used in different languages. So you'll see something like RF, which stands for the Russian Federation. The Russians will often use domain names that end in Cyrillic because that's the alphabet that they use. And instead of .cn, you may see Zhongguo, which is what they would use in China. Or you might see Hanguk instead of South Korea. Or you see Masr if you're talking about instead of Egypt. All of these are using their respective alphabets for the country rather than the Latin alphabet that we're familiar with. And that way, the web names look more familiar to the public, and the public doesn't have to learn both their native language and English in order to access the web. So we're adding to the internationalization of the internet. We're adding to the ability for people to for the internet to be able to reach multiple cultures out here through this internationalization. And keep in mind that all of these characters can be reached through Unicode, which we talked about in our first unit when we started talking about the letters, because all of these are part of Unicode. Unicode is this extensive list of all the different letters of all the possible alphabets that are out there, including alphabets of extinct languages, including music symbols, including mathematical symbols, including engineering symbols. Lots of different symbols are in this Unicode. So Now that we've had a chance to talk about what DNS stands for and this human aspect of the internet as opposed to this just mechanical, numerical aspect of the internet, I want to talk about what you're going to be doing on the studio.code.org website. So here I am at the unit, and we're talking about, stage 9, the need for DNS. And so there are some things that you're going to be doing here. So if I click here, you're going to see some of the vocabulary we're talking about, the domain name system, and some of the things that we're going to be doing. One of the things that you're going to be doing is you're going to be getting onto this network that we've had, the routers that we've set up. Every student's going to have their own IP address, but they're also going to have a host name. And also keep in mind that these host names can change as computers pop on and off the internet. These DNSs are updated. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our next lesson. But what you're going to have to do is get onto a server and communicate with other people using domain names rather than using IP addresses. So you're going to have to ask the domain name server, what is the domain name that's associated with this person, who would just be, instead of just an IP address as we're used to. Then once you've done that, there's going to be some questions for you to answer, which you're going to go ahead and go through, just our typical fare. So, once again, this is Mr. Potter. Thank you for watching. Have a great day.